Kris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War for the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm standing in New Hope Church Cemetery, so things are going to be a little more subdued for this time. We've got a lot of ground to cover, literally, to get the armies all the way from Resaca down here, and I'm going to say Ustanala now because I've been practicing it ever since we left Resaca, where the Federal Army got across the river, outflanked Joe Johnston, forced him out of his position at Resaca, and so what Johnston's going to do is then fall back to the next major stop on the Western and Atlantic Railroad. If you remember in an earlier video, Will Green talked about how these two armies are really tied to that railroad and they need it for supplies. And so Johnston rightfully assumes that Sherman's going to stick close to that railroad as he advances south from Chattanooga. So when Johnston gets to Kingston, he's going to set a trap and actually send John Bell Hood's corps off to a little town called Cassville that's just a little bit to the northeast of Kingston. And he's going to assume that Sherman's going to come down along the railroad and maybe use a secondary road a little farther to the east and come at Kingston. And that's where then Johnston's going to spring his trap and have Hood swing shut and hit an isolated portion of Sherman's army group. And by doing so, Hood's then going to throw Sherman into turmoil. Well, in fact, as Sherman's making the advance, things are looking good for Johnston. He gets the last of his reinforcements, so he is at full strength. But even as Hood is ready to spring the trap, everyone in the Confederate Army is feeling good. Hood sees Federal cavalry off on his eastern flank. And he's like, wait, what's going on? And suddenly Hood thinks he's the one that's being outflanked instead of him outflanking the Federals. And so he's going to call that off. And that's going to force Johnston to withdraw again. To his dying day, Johnston's going to believe that Hood was hoodwinked. But in fact, there is Federal cavalry out there. Hood makes a smart call by pulling back. So then what Johnston has to do is pull further back, and he's going to go to the Allatoona Pass, again assuming that Sherman is going to follow along the railroad. In doing so, he gives up the Etowah River as part of all of this maneuvering. So he gives up the Ustanala, he gives up the Etowah, two potential river crossings he could contest that he doesn't. And this is going to then start to really chip away at the morale of the Confederate Army because they have retreated all the way from Rocky Face Ridge south. And, the Confederates are wondering, are we going to retreat all the way to the Gulf of Mexico at this point? But Johnston at Allatoona Pass figures he's got the absolute perfect trap because Sherman's armies are going to have to funnel through this narrow gap in the mountains. Well, Sherman, he's familiar with this area of Georgia. He knows about the pass. He knows that it's a perfect trap. And so what he's going to do for the first time in the campaign is strike away from the railroad. He now is at full capacity too. Frank Blair's corps has joined his army, and so now he's up about 80,000 guys, full capacity, and he's going to tell his army to equip themselves for 20 days worth of marching. And they're going to then swing to the right of Johnson, to Sherman's right, to Johnston's left, to get around Johnston, breaking away from the railroad. He's going to do so crossing the Etowah and using 6 different roads. It's sort of like streamers coming down from the south and swinging down past Johnston, who's going to get outflanked yet again from what should have been a nearly impregnable position. And that's going to force Johnston to then break away from the railroad and try to intercept Sherman before Sherman can get too far into his rear. That's going to set the armies both on a collision course toward Dallas. First portions of the army are actually to come to this area that's behind me, New Hope Church. John Bell Hood swinging in here. Johnston's going to get here first because he's got the interior line. Hood is going to then deploy here on the right of Johnston's position with Bishop Polk to his left and then Hardee off to the far left. So we've got Hood, Polk, Hardee putting this long arc to block Sherman's advance. And the Federals are a-coming. And to talk about that clash, I'm going to bring on my good friend Kris White to talk about the May 25th battle at New Hope Church.
Thanks, Kris. And if what you're seeing here on the Atlanta campaign is that we're Joe Johnston, we're the Army of Tennessee commander for the Confederacy, and we are falling back falling back, falling back. We started this campaign up at Dalton, Georgia, and now here we are 27 miles outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Real estate is starting to become a scarce commodity for the Confederates, and now they are going to keep setting up new lines. We had Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, came across the Oostenaula River, the Etowah River, where the Federals will stop for a few days, and eventually here we end up at the Dallas New Hope Church and Pickett's Mill line. About an 8-mile or so line, as Kris laid out for us, commanded by such luminaries as John Bell Hood, West Point class of 1853, soon to be the commander of this army. Then we have Leonidas Polk with just a few days to live here, giving away the end of that story. West Point graduate of the class of 1827. We'll talk about him on another video, but he's one of my favorite generals to hate in the Civil War. And of course, we have William Joseph Hardee, West Point graduate of the class of 1838. And Hardee, he is going to lead the march down here to the New Hope Church line, and following in behind him will be John Bell Hood's corps. As they're coming down this way, William T. Sherman is actually surprised that the Confederates are moving this quickly. He's actually not expecting the Confederates to have established a new defensive line here. And as we get closer to Atlanta, we only have a few more lines to choose from. We have another one I'm going to call the Pine Mountain line. There's also Lone Mountain and Bushy Mountain down there. Then we have the Chattahoochee River. Great songs by Alan Jackson about the Chattahoochee. Then you go across there, it's Atlanta. So we're giving up too much real estate if we're the Confederates, and now we're going to make another stand here. On the Federal side, as I mentioned, William T. Sherman's moving his what we call a modern army group down here. That's not a term from the Civil War. But as he's moving down here, in the lead is his hard-hitting 20th Corps. That's the consolidation of the Union 11th and 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac. They came here to the Western Theater in September of 1863, and now we've created this amalgamation of 3 divisions. When they came over here, we had some of the 11th Corps troops, some 12th Corps troops, and now we've mixed in some troops from the Army of the Cumberland into there, because that's who the 20th Corps is now part of, under the George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, West Point graduate of the class of 1840, and also a classmate of William T. Sherman. Thomas is going to start moving his men down this way, commanded by Joseph Hooker. That's the 20th Corps commander. And as Hooker moves down into this area, we'd actually be looking at the Confederate line here. We're inside of Alexander Stewart's line of Confederates. Stewart has actually set up Marcellus Stovall's brigade, today commanded by Abda Johnston of the 40th Georgia. Stovall's not feeling very well, and they would have been up on this ridge line, actually in and amongst the headstones. Now we have modern headstones mixed in with historic headstones out here at the New Hope Church Cemetery. New Hope Church, the modern one, is over my right shoulder, and just through the trees you might be able to see to the right there as well. To my right you might be able to see the white structure of the reconstructed New Hope Church. I think that's the 4th church that's on this site. But if you come down here, the William J. Hardee Sons of Confederate Veterans actually oversee some monuments back there, recreated earthworks, some original earthworks. There's one of the micro sites for the National Park Service for the Atlanta campaign over there. But the Confederate battle line is actually running just behind me, down across towards New Hope Church. It's going up to the northeast of where I'm standing. So if you think about the Confederate line along this area, it's actually running on about a 45-degree angle in a blocking position from Dallas on their left, New Hope Church in the center, Pickett's Mill on their right. Now, Alexander Stewart, West Point graduate of the class of 1842. He is a longtime veteran here in the Confederate Army of Tennessee, seasoned commander, and he is also going to set up in this area some Louisianans under Randall Gibson, and then flanking them we'll have some Alabamians under some other brigades. Those men are going to entrench, but because we're inside of a cemetery, Marcellus Stovall's guys, or Johnston's guys today, as it were, will not be setting up earthen fortifications because they're worried about digging up a graveyard. But coming in front of them will be Joseph Hooker and his 20th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland. Joe Hooker, Mr. F.J. Hooker, as someone is known to call him. West Point graduate of the class of 1837, 49 years old, Hadley, Massachusetts native. He's everybody who loves to hate him, but I love me some Joe Hooker. If I could sit down and have dinner with one general, it'd be Joe Hooker. I wouldn't believe a word that comes out of his mouth, but I'm going to have a good time. Joe Hooker is going to deploy his three divisions out in front of New Hope Church. They're actually marching down towards us, not thinking they're going to run into Confederates. John White Gary, commanding one of the divisions, is going to go off to the right, while off to the left will go the divisions of Daniel Butterfield and Alpheus Williams. None of those guys are West Pointers, but Gary's men is going to bump into some Confederates, and then we're going to backtrack if we are the rest of Butterfield's and Williams' men, and we're going to deploy for battle. Sherman thinks he's found a rear guard, essentially. We found a small group of Confederates, so let's attack. Let's see if we can get them in the open. Well, the Confederates aren't exactly in the open, and they are here in force. So out in front of us would be a gully known after the battle. There you go. Gary got it?
Yeah.
So here we go. There's the hell hole that you see here. It's a gully out in front. The American Battlefield Trust, as well as the Georgia Battlefield Association, helped to preserve that land, I think, in 1997. So these men will go down into a gully, and if you go into a gully, you're not going to be able to see what's out in front of you. And coming up in the fore will be Alpheus Williams, Yale graduate, Connecticut Yankee via Michigan. He rides my favorite horse's name in the Civil War, Old Plug Ugly. He is going to deploy his men, one brigade behind the other. And then coming up on his flank will be Daniel Butterfield, the former chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac, and he is the pet of Joseph Hooker. To tell you all you need to know about Daniel Butterfield, there's a story about him. His dad is one of the founders of the American Express Company, and Dan Butterfield is kind of a rich kid. And as he's growing up, he decides he wants to start his own fire company. And back in the day, you could get paid to go put out fires. Well, there were no fires up in Utica, New York. So he decides to go catch a church on fire. Catches it on fire. He takes his fire company over there to put it out. He's too late. So Dad, to bail him out of jail and avoid jail time, has to pay for the church to be rebuilt. So if you're Dan Butterfield, never leave home without Dad. So Dan Butterfield is going to be out here. He's going to stack his brigades one behind the other, and then following up will be John White Gary's division. John White Gary's division has done a lot of hard fighting here during the Atlanta campaign. They're going to see more hard action as well. But as they come down into that hellhole, as they're going to dub it, they're going to break up into open ground, and they're going to start taking on Alexander Stewart's men. Stewart's men are going to fire into them at points from three sides. I think there's a quote from Alpheus Williams that said that they were firing on all sides of us except for our rear, because they were actually concentrating fire in different places. The 123rd New York out here has some fantastic accounts of what happens, but the Confederates out here are in such a strong position that when Alexander Stewart's asked, do you need reinforcements? He says, no, we got this. You can keep your reinforcements. How many times do you see that on a Civil War battlefield? Anyone makes first contact with an enemy, they're like, we need help now, especially George McClellan. But out here, Alexander P. Stewart is out here making sure he's holding the line. They're going to throw back those Union forces with heavy losses. Confederates will lose anywhere between 350 and 450 men on May 25th, 1864. Out in front of us, more than 1,600 Union soldiers will fall. This will be a very lopsided victory for the Confederates here at New Hope Church. Now, May 25th, 1864, let's take a step back for just a minute and look at what's going on in the war right now. We're up in the eastern theater of the American Civil War. We have a battle taking place at the North Anna River where members of the American Battlefield Trust helped to save a lot of land at North Anna River. So we have the two principal armies moving towards Atlanta, moving towards Richmond and Petersburg. Ulysses S. Grant with the Army of the Potomac moving down to the south. We have moving down to the southeast, William T. Sherman. And then we have some other things that have happened. The New Market battle in the Valley that's going to throw off that Valley campaign of early 1864 under Franz Sigel. We'll have Ben Butler getting bottled up on the Bermuda 100. And we have the Red River campaign that's already been a failure, and some things happening out in Western Virginia. So the two principal armies right now, Grant's army in the east, Sherman's army group in the west, have made contact and are making their way to those two principal cities towards Richmond. Eventually we know they'll go to Petersburg, but they're 27 miles away here from Atlanta at New Hope Church. And this is not going to be one battle here. We're going to have a battle off on our right flank, off on our left flank. So the next action that will take place is at a Georgia historical site known as Pickett's Mill. And to pick up that part of the story, I'll turn it over to Gary Edelman, Chief Historian of the American Battlefield Trust, and he kind of likes pictures, so he might have a few for you.
Yeah, I might. I already showed the main one I have. Thanks, Kris. So, first of all, Kris went all contextual on us, so let me slow down for a while to show that the Confederates sort of have one big semi-interior line here. We're at New Hope Church. If you go off to the left there, and if Kris Mackowski behind the camera can follow me there, if you go beyond the church and follow it out several miles, you'll be at Dallas. Likewise, if you come off this way and come over this way, you start to get toward Pickett's Mill, several miles off in that direction there. So, Kris was going to go all the way to Pickett's Mill there. So what you have initially is Confederates sort of occupying Dallas and New Hope Church, but by May 27th, the Union senses an opportunity, and they're going to send Howard's 4th Corps off in an arc over toward Pickett's Mill. That's off to that side, owned by a guy named Benjamin Pickett, if I'm correct, and his grave is right beyond those trees over there. He had already been killed by this point in the war at the Battle of Chickamauga that we just visited for some of our videos already. So he's going to go over toward Pickett's Mill, but unfortunately for Howard, who is sent up toward Pickett's Mill to strengthen and extend the Confederate right, but Patrick Cleburne, again, you know, perhaps or almost certainly the best division commander in the Confederate Army of Tennessee at the time. He shows up there. So if you're a betting person, you can sort of maybe guess about exactly how this thing is going to go. Nonetheless, one of the things that Kris Mackowski was talking about is Sherman's ability to outflank Joseph Johnston's soldiers. Well, I'll tell you what, when your army is basically twice the size of your enemies, you're able to do that pretty easily. Hold them in place, move around. You've got a whole extra army to play with, basically. And when it comes down to fighting, by this point in the war, east and west, you are basically talking about Confederate divisions fighting Union Corps. Union Corps against Confederate divisions. And while Confederate divisions can be kind of big, they're half the size of Union Corps. And that is what the Confederates are dealing with here. And this is what Alexander P. Stewart felt was enough. One division could repulse a Union Corps at that point, and that's going to be the story of Pickett's Mill. When Howard moves in, thinks he's not really facing much, but he's really facing at least 4 brigades under Patrick Cleburne. You've heard of some of them, Govan and Granbury and others, with some cavalry on the end there. Howard decides to attack not with his entire corps, but rather with one brigade, William B. Hazen's brigade. And this will begin the crime of Pickett's Mill as the Union advances that brigade, supported by a couple of other brigades. You've heard of them, Carlin and Knopfler, and did I say Knopfler? Neffler and Gibson, Scribner, King are all going to eventually take part in this battle, but it's not going to matter. The Confederates are going to pin them down. There's going to be sharp fighting for sure, but this one Confederate division will inflict more than 3 times the casualties than they suffer themselves. 500 from Cleburne, 1,600 from Howard, and we are looking at a difficult situation for the Union. They were going to find nobody here. They're stymied at New Hope. They're stymied at Pickett's Mill. Maybe they'll be a little bit more successful over at Dallas. Now, as Kris mentioned, this fight at Pickett's Mill is little known, and yet it's got the most preserved land. Go there and see 700 plus acres over there, and we're talking some pristine acres. It's worth checking out if you go there. Now, one thing about this battle is that it's largely forgotten. A lot of the commanders didn't even mention it, sort of lost in the shadow of other more famous actions. Kennesaw Mountain 1 month ahead, New Hope Church over here in the open, and Pickett's Mill's fought in the woods. It's fought in nasty terrain. So, but the crime going on there, it was spoken by one of Granbury's soldiers who looked out in front and never saw such a ghastly scene as the bodies heaped up, and he moved straight up from saying it was indescribable to saying how proud they were at the way that they mowed down and repulsed the Yankees in their attack over there. Now, one more thing about Pickett's Mill here, and that is because we at the American Battlefield Trust hear from people if they like interpretation at a site or if they don't, even if we don't control the site, like the case at Pickett's Mill, which is, I believe, owned by the state. At Pickett's Mill, you have some people writing to us telling us, well, Pickett's Mill wasn't even a battle at all. It's really just a skirmish. We have other people saying, no, this is a slog going on from late May into early June, and they don't interpret that whole thing as well. Other people say the cavalry took a much bigger part in that, and they're not talking, and that's not talked about enough. And then there are others that say that that site exists solely to glorify the Confederacy and whatnot. These things have a way of working themselves out. We do have plenty of primary sources. You don't have to just listen to us. Go read some of those sources. Learn about Pickett's Mill. Dig into it. You'll always be a little bit better off. And I think the interpretive mess will eventually be cleaned up. I see Kris Mackowski sort of hanging off to my left over here, so I'm going to let him on. Kris?
And the fighting's not done yet, and I'm going to ask Kris White to come on and sort of wrap up some of the fighting here, but I do want to interject at this point because the key things about New Hope Church and Pickett's Mill is that even though, whether you consider them to be minor skirmishes, big flashy fights, part of a big long slog, they're crucial for Johnston's army because they provide him with 2 much-needed wins at a time, as I mentioned earlier, where Confederate morale in this army is bottoming out. And suddenly Stuart has this great effect at the center of the line. In fact, he writes home and says that I might be egotistical enough to think that my example inspired the men. And in fact, it did. The victory with Cleburne's men, who just keep throwing themselves into the hardest of fights. Again, a very important victory from a morale point of view from the Confederates. Meanwhile, from the Federals, Gary's alluded to the crime at Pickett's Mill. Lieutenant Ambrose Spears hears the order come down from Howard to Thomas Wood, who says, I'm going to send in Hazen's brigade. Let's see what sort of success they have before he decides to back him up with any of those other brigades that Gary mentioned. Bierce overhears this as Hazen overhears it. Hazen knows I'm being sent in without any support. And Bierce says that he could interpret the expression on Hazen's face and understand the criminal blunder of the order. But Hazen, being who Hazen is, goes in, he does his duty, and the whole event is a crime from the federal perspective, as Bierce later describes it. So when we're talking about the impact of these fights here, they're huge from a morale point of view, really helping the Confederates and really hurting the Federals. But as I said, the fighting's not over. Now we're going to shift to the far end of the line, and to talk about the fighting at Dallas, let me bring Kris White back on.
So who shot JR? Is that the? Yeah, I told them that I would open with that. The Battle of Dallas, it's going to be the closing action along this New Hope Pickett's Mill Dallas line here. What we're going to see is actually the Confederates sally out of their works to do battle on the extreme left of their line. Now, what we have to remember is that these armies are living, breathing machines. They're actually going to be moving around a lot. So to get to Pickett's Mill, what we have to do is start shifting around the Army of the Cumberland as well as the Army of the Ohio under John Schofield, West Point class of 1853. We could have a West Point reunion for the class of 53. Howard, Schofield, and James Birdsey McPherson are all West Point graduates, the class of 53. So what they're going to start to do is shift the troops around, and what William Hardee thinks that he sees, that Confederate commander on the left of the Confederate lines, thinks that he sees some sort of an opening. So he's going to turn to future Tennessee Governor William Bate and tell him to head out and make an attack with approximately 5,000 men. Frank Armstrong, a former dragoon from the Old Army, will be sent out first kind of to feel out the federal lines on May 28th, 1864, and as they go forward, Bates' men will start to follow up. They're actually going to break the line of John Blackjack Logan and his 15th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee. That's the Union Army of the Tennessee. Remember, if there's a "the" in there, they're Union, or they're Federal, or they're Northerners. If there's not a "the," they're Confederates, they're rebels, or they're Southerners. So think about that whenever you start to read about these battles. So Bates' men will actually go forward, break through the federal lines. They're going to capture an Iowa battery, I believe, maybe Indiana. As they get through the lines, they're going to break through, and Logan himself is actually going to start to rally the Peter Osterhaus's division, as well as William Harrow's division, former Easterner there, if you know about him, as well as Kenner Garrard, a guy who fought on Little Round Tops, fighting down that way with some Union cav. These counterattacks by John Logan will actually drive back Bates' men, and this will be a Union victory along this line here at Dallas New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill. And it's also, as Kris mentioned, a needed victory for the Federals. Keep in mind, they're moving closer and closer to Atlanta, but every time they do so, most of the time they've had to make attacks, even if they're making holding attacks, like the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio did at places like Resaca, as well as up at Rocky Gap. God, I can't think.
Rocky Face Ridge?
Rocky Face Ridge. We've been in too many places this last 24 hours. So as they're always going to be making these attacks. John White Gary's division, specifically the 20th Corps, is going to take just hellacious casualties throughout this campaign. And they're going to do a lot of hard fighting, as will on the Confederate side, Patrick Cleburne's division. You want to talk about Johnny on the spot, if something needs to be done, if there's a hard fighting to be done, it's going to be Patrick Cleburne's division. So what you're going to see are casualties starting to mount up, nothing like you're going to see in the Eastern Theater. But With Sherman moving around so many troops, Joe Johnston is starting to worry once again that Sherman is going to start to try to outflank him. What is Sherman doing here in the Western Theater? He's going to keep going around Johnston's left, Johnston's left, Johnston's left. Look at the Overland campaign. Grant goes around Lee's right, Lee's right, Lee's right. So what we see are these men constantly trying to maneuver when possible. When the Confederates block them, try to find a way here in the Atlantic campaign to not make full-on frontal assaults, though those will happen here later in our video series at a place called Kennesaw Mountain, not too far from where we are. But what we're starting to see now is Johnston, again, becoming a little skittish. As he's becoming more skittish, he sees that the federal troops are going to start shifting around. They're going to start moving towards Altoona Pass again. And now Johnston feels by June 3rd, right around the time those assaults are taking place at Cold Harbor in the Eastern Theater, that he is going to have to abandon this line and pull back to the next line that is going to be to the south of us, and that will be along the Pine Mountain range that we're going to go to next, down to a place called Gilgal Church, which is down near Lost Mountain, Bushy Mountain, and as well as Pine Mountain. So what we're starting to see here, again, Johnston pulling back. Those Fabian tactics, those are named after a Roman general, delaying tactics, trying to string out your enemy. Those are going to start to backfire on Johnston on two fronts. The military front, and especially the political front. Because now politicians are starting to whisper in the ear of the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, saying that Johnston's not our guy. He's not standing and fighting like we need. Look how close he's getting to Atlanta. Our rail centers, there's 4 rail lines running into Atlanta. We also have munitions factories, we have warehouses, we have a lot of civilians. This is a town at this point that's probably swelled to 20,000 people due to the war industry. So now we're having a real problem with Joe Johnston on the political front as well as the military front. And as we get closer to Atlanta, those problems are just going to keep compounding and compounding until we have a replacement on July 17th, whenever Johnston is going to be relieved of command, and in the 18th, John Bell Hood takes over. We're not quite there yet, but what we're looking at is Kris Mackowski going to come in here and ruin my ending.
Only because, I'm sorry, we've been talking east and west. I want to bring out the one commander of the Army of Northern Virginia that we always forget about, Gustavus Smith. Since he got...
You really interrupted me for
I
Gustavus
did,
Smith.
because he got booted from his command out in the east, and he gets sent here. And so in retirement, he's in command of the Etowah Iron Works, and that's the one thing, as Kris has been talking about, with this industrial capacity in Georgia that's being threatened. Smith's able to evacuate the ironworks and all of its facilities to get him south as Johnston's doing this Fabian thing. But that feeds into a lot of this political discontent. And now
all right, speaking of getting booted.
Yeah, I return you to our originally scheduled program.
Let's finish this thing.
Gustavus W. Smith, for those of you who don't know, New Yorker, West Point graduate, former second in command of Joe Johnston's army, doesn't get the Army of Northern Virginia after Johnston is wounded, sent here to the Deep South basically to be sat off to the sidelines. So I think everyone needed a Gustavus Smith break. Well, with that, I'm just going to wrap it up here, and what we're going to do is keep following these two armies. We're going to move to the next defensive line. We're going to head to a place called Gilgal Church. There's some really cool recreated fortifications down there. The church no longer stands. It was actually obliterated during the battle, and then we're going to move on to the death site of one of the highest-ranking Confederate officers in the entire war, and the highest ranking Confederate officer to fall during the Atlanta campaign. Go over to Pine Mountain. You'll learn more about who that is a little bit later. So on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. I want to thank Gary Edelman behind the camera, Gustavus W. Mackowski on the other side of the camera, our friends down here at the Georgia Battlefield Association who helped to preserve the hellhole that is behind us, not the cemetery, but actually the deep ravine that is just over my shoulder, just on the other side of that property there, as well as everyone who's trying to preserve the efforts down here at New Hope Church. We hope you get down here. We'll put this on our video. We'll get you GPS coordinates and get down to New Hope Church. And we make our way towards Atlanta. I'm Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust. Thanks for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation.